Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. So, starting out with coding, it can feel like there are just a bazillion different paths you could take, and honestly, kind of makes you wish you'd gotten started way back when, right?
Well, we're diving into some articles from scitechgen.com today. They're all about making tech a little less, well, scary. And one thing they really hit on is this whole idea that you need to be coding before you can even, drive. Because let's face it, seeing a headline like, "Never too late, learning programming at 24 and beyond," that can either be super reassuring or just make you feel like you missed the boat.
It's true. It's interesting, though, just how strong that whole start young thing is in tech.
It really is.
Almost like you're supposed to have coded your first website back in middle school or something.
Right. Like it's some secret language you can only learn as a kid or exactly.
But this article, it really digs into that. They're saying anyone, any age, can learn to code. It's more about finding what motivates you and sticking with it, really.
Yeah, and I'd even argue that having some life experience outside of coding, actually gives you a leg up.
Oh, interesting.
Gives you a different way of looking at problems, different problem-solving skills even.
That's a good point. It's not always about the technical stuff. It's about how you approach things.
Absolutely.
How you think creatively. Okay, so we've tackled this age thing, but that still leaves, like, a zillion programming languages to pick from. scitechgen.com, they have another article called 5 Tips on How to Learn Programming Languages. Best programming language to start with. And they make a really big deal about choosing the right tool for what you're trying to do. Like, you wouldn't use a hammer to tighten the screw, right?
Exactly, yeah. Each language has its own, strengths, weaknesses. Using Python, which is great for data analysis, to design a whole website, it just wouldn't be the best way to go about it.
That makes sense. So how do you figure out which language is the right tool for the kind of coding you want to do?
Well, that's where it gets kind of interesting, because even though each language has its own specialty, there is a lot of overlap in the core ideas they're built on.
So it's less about memorizing a specific language and more about understanding those, fundamental building blocks.
You got it. It's kind of like learning to cook, actually. Once you understand the basics, heat, time, how different ingredients work together, you can apply those to any type of cuisine.
I like that. Makes programming seem a lot less intimidating. So where do we even begin with unpacking those core concepts? There's this other SciTech article. Which programming language should I learn first? 1, is there a clear winner in terms of the best place to start?
The guy who wrote this article, he's been teaching programming for over 30 years. And even he says there's no one best language for everyone.
Okay, so no shortcuts there.
Yeah.
But this article does recommend a specific path, going from C to Java, then on to Python. What's the thinking behind that order?
It's like, imagine you're building a house, right? You wouldn't start with the fancy light fixtures before you even have a foundation.
Makes sense.
C++ Ghost, those are like your foundation languages in programming. They get you up close and personal with how the software actually talks to your computer's hardware.
So it's about understanding the nitty-gritty of how computers think at the lowest level.
Exactly. One of the big things you learn in CCC is memory management. How your computer stores information and finds it again when it needs it.
Kind of like organizing a massive warehouse, making sure everything has its place.
Perfect analogy.
So that's where Java comes in.
Right. Java takes those foundational ideas and it adds in this really powerful way of structuring your code called object-oriented programming.
I've heard that term a lot, but what does it actually mean when you're writing code?
Okay, so instead of a house, let's say you're building a car. Now, instead of designing every single piece from scratch, the engine, the wheels, the seats, you create these blueprints for each component. Those blueprints, those are your objects in object-oriented programming.
So you're creating these reusable chunks of code, basically. That sounds way more efficient than writing everything out from zero every single time.
Exactly. And because you learned how to manage memory efficiently with C-size, C++, you'll have this deeper understanding of how those objects use your computer's resources.
So it's like knowing how much space each car part takes up in your warehouse and how to put them all together to make a working car.
Exactly. And that brings us to Python. Python is great because it's really readable and flexible, but what makes it really powerful is its libraries.
Libraries? Now, I'm picturing dusty bookshelves. Are we talking about the same thing here?
Not exactly. In programming, a library is basically a pre-made toolkit for common tasks. Let's say you're trying to write some code that grabs information from a website. Now, doing that from scratch can get really complex. But with Python, you can just use a library like requests to handle all that communication for you.
So it's about working smarter, not harder.
Yeah.
Right? Using these pre-built tools to make the whole coding process faster.
You got it. And since you've got that solid foundation in CCTP and Java, you can actually understand how those libraries work under the hood. You can troubleshoot problems better and even build your own tools later on.
So the CCCTA, Java, then Python path?
Yeah.
It's like designed to make you a well-rounded programmer, not just someone who's memorized a bunch of code, right?
Exactly. And learning one language makes the next one easier, especially when you start with the core concepts like that.
This is really giving me a much better sense of how all these programming languages kind of fit together.
Yeah.
It's like learning grammar before you learn vocabulary almost.
Exactly. And like with spoken languages, once you've got one down, you start to see the patterns in the others.
Okay, so this path we've been talking about, C++, Java, then Python, it makes sense, right, for building that foundation. But what about all the other languages out there? Like you hear about SQL, JavaScript all the time. Kind of hard to ignore those, right?
Oh, for sure. And that's actually a great example of where your programming journey might go once you've got that solid base. CCC, Java, Python, those are great for all kinds of things. But languages like SQL and JavaScript, they really shine in specific areas.
So where do they fit in then?
Well, let's take SQL. SQL is the language of databases.
Databases, okay.
So any website, any app that stores user info, product catalogs, really any kind of data, organized data, SQL is how you talk to all that behind-the-scenes stuff.
So if you're into data analysis, data science, even just understanding how websites store all that info, SQL is key.
Absolutely, yeah. Then you've got JavaScript. All the languages we've talked about so far, they mostly handle the logic, the data, kind of in the background. JavaScript is about what you actually see and interact with on a web page.
Right. It's what makes websites dynamic, interactive, clicking buttons, animations, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And JavaScript, it usually works hand in hand with these two other languages, HTML and CSS.
I've heard of those.
HTML, that's the skeleton of your web page, defines the structure, the content.
Okay.
CSS, that's like the styling, the colors, fonts, layout, all that.
So it's a real team effort to build the websites we use every day.
You could say that. And they each build on each other. You might use your C, and Java skills to build this powerful web server.
Right.
And then use JavaScript, HTML, CSS to create that front-end experience that everyone loves.
This is making so much more sense. It's not about finding this one right language to learn. It's more about knowing the strengths of each one and how they work together.
I'm glad to hear it. And that's the cool thing about programming. There's always something new to learn. But once you've got that foundation, you can branch out into anything that interests you.
So, to sum it all up, learning to code is absolutely doable, no matter where you're coming from. The important thing is to start with those core programming ideas, build that strong base. And SciTechGen.com, they recommend that path of going from C, C++ to Java, then to Python.
And remember, that path is a fantastic place to start, but ultimately, the perfect language for you really depends on the problems you want to solve, the things you want to create.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
It's easy to get lost in all the technical stuff, but at the end of the day, coding, it's a tool, right? It's a tool to help you make your ideas real.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
So for everyone listening, think about what gets you excited. Building websites, crunching data, making games. Let those passions guide you as you dive into this whole world of programming. And for a much deeper dive on all these topics, and believe me, there's so much more to cover, head over to SciTechGen.com. They've got tons of articles to keep that curiosity satisfied. Thanks for joining us on this coding journey. We'll see you next time. Happy coding.